Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, President Xi extends his grip across China and Hong Kong. Taiwan could be next. As Beijing expands its navy and trains missiles on the country, what will the US response be? Also this week, a failed decades-old policy of unfettered free market economics. What next for Chile as the people redefine the economy to eliminate inequality? Plus, tax the rich. Argentina starts a debate on who should pay for the pandemic, a thorny question many countries are starting to ponder. Well, China is tightening its grip on Hong Kong. New laws imposed by Beijing disqualified 4 lawmakers for being unpatriotic. That prompted 14 pro-democracy lawmakers to quit. As President Xi has consolidated his power, scrapping a 2-term presidential limit, he's crushed voices opposed to him and has taken a firmer grip on the autonomous region of Xinjiang, detaining millions of Uyghurs in hundreds of internment camps. And Xi may not be done yet. His next focus could be the island nation of Taiwan, which it claims as its own territory. Xi has gone as far as saying it's an inevitable requirement for the historical rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But just how feasible is this? Well, according to the South China Morning Post, China has deployed its most advanced hypersonic missiles to its southeast coast as it prepares for a possible invasion. That's because Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen has refused to accept the One China principle. It's moved more Marines closer to Taiwan and held invasion drills. Despite the pandemic, China has increased its military spending by 6.6% this year as it sees ever-increasing threats. China has built the world's biggest navy, a fleet of 350 warships, to stake its claim to the South China Sea. That's raising concerns in Washington, which is pledging to counter and expand its warship fleet from 293 to 355. President Trump, for his part, agreed last month to sell 100 Harpoon anti-ship missiles worth $2.4 billion to Taiwan. It also sold $1.8 billion worth of land attack mobile missiles. It's all part of Taiwan's hedgehog strategy to resist an invasion. President-elect Joe Biden hasn't expressed a view on Taiwan yet, but he has assured Japan the U.S. would help defend the disputed Senkaku Islands, which Beijing claims too. The Trump administration has signed a 5-year economic deal with Taiwan, despite objections from China. The deal falls short of a full-blown trade deal. Well, joining me now from Singapore is Ian Chong. He's the Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. Good to have you with us. So China's been quite assertive when it comes to Hong Kong, when it comes to the Uyghurs. Will Taiwan be next? Might it be facing an invasion?
I think an invasion is probably a bit far off at this point in time. But certainly, China will be putting on more pressure on Taiwan. We've been seeing increased military activity, including an increase in the frequency of flights of military aircraft in and near Taiwan, Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and also around Taiwan, crossing the median line. These are efforts, I think, to put more pressure on Taiwan to suggest to its government and people that they should not behave in ways that the PRC does not like.
Has China ultimately got the ability right now to do an invasion if it wanted to? Some point to things like the number of landing craft and say, you know, it might be one thing to point your missiles and fly more aircraft, but other key components are missing.
Right. So an all-out invasion, I think, is going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging for several reasons. One, of course, is the logistical capability of landing craft, of aircraft to support an invasion force. The other is, of course, the weather. In the Taiwan Strait, the seas there can be a bit unpredictable. So getting large amounts of people and material across can be a bit tricky. And of course, crossing that expanse of water would mean that these vessels could be picked off from the Taiwan side. So there's a high amount of risk. I don't think it's that feasible for China to do at this moment. But of course, an invasion is, I think, quite an extreme measure. There are lots of other coercive measures that China can possibly take that don't get into invasion territory.
However much more assertive Beijing wants to be over Taiwan, would there be much of an international backlash?
So I think it depends on how the clash happens. If Beijing engineers a situation where it looks like the Taiwanese side is being clearly egregious or excessive, then perhaps there'll be less of a backlash. Or if the Taiwanese side does something that is on its own accord that is highly unacceptable in the eyes of the international community, meaning to say that if Taiwan unilaterally decided that it wanted to declare independence right away, or that it wanted to act in ways that provoke the PRC actively without having reason to do so. But short of those, and I think those are very unlikely scenarios because Taiwan has a leadership that is pretty calm and seems to know what it's doing. So in that sense, whatever response to Chinese coercion, especially if it gets increase, if it seems excessive, I think there would be more of an international backlash. How much of it would there be? Whether that has an effect on changing China's course of action, I think remains to be seen. But I think in general, there is going to be a lot more resistance and unhappiness toward Chinese excessiveness today.
But we haven't seen US President-elect Joe Biden take a position yet on Taiwan. Why?
I think what we've seen him do is to talk about, or at least his proxies in terms of people who, including Anthony Blinken, who's the presumptive Secretary of State, talk about increasing ties and improving relations with Taiwan. So presumably that is reflective of his position. The reason why President elect Biden himself has not come across, I suppose, is because he does not think that the Taiwan issue needs to be put on a priority. It doesn't have to be put at the focus of U.S. foreign relations right now. And of course, we also know that his focus is, his declared focus is on the pandemic. It's on fixing the U.S. economy. So he probably doesn't want other issues, Taiwan included, to get in the way of that primary agenda.
Well, we've seen Taiwan is buying more U.S. weapons. President Trump giving Taiwan these critical weapons. This is all part, I guess, of Taiwan's hedgehog strategy and perhaps trying to get as much as it can out of the current U.S. administration. So
the Taiwan side has been trying to increase its defensive capability for a while. This current tranche of weapon sales, it's come up at a time where Taiwan has been facing increasing pressure from China. I mentioned the military activity from the Chinese side. So in that sense, it's quite clear that the Taiwan side would want to up its ability to be a hedgehog, to be able to at least impose costs that are pretty heavy on China, should China choose to be more aggressive. I mean, the whole idea for the Taiwan side is to make an invasion, make any sort of coercive attempt difficult, such that there's always going to be an element of doubt in the minds of the Chinese decision makers that would cause them to hold back, right? So this current round of arms sales, feeds into that strategy, given the fact that China has upped the ante on its side.
Is it surprising the US is selling weapons to Taiwan, yet the US still doesn't have a full-blown trade deal with Taiwan?
I think this gets in part to the Trump administration's general reticence and sensitivity towards opening up more trade deals. So actually, for the Trump administration, this is already, I think, a pretty significant step, right? It's not sort of gone through with new trade deals, it's renegotiated existing ones. So that's on the Trump administration side. On the other, I think there's also recognition that the US public is not as ready to be more open economically at this point in time. So I think in terms of the economic relationship with Taiwan, that trade arrangement is probably as far, goes as far as is feasible for an outgoing administration. It goes as far as probably the US public can stomach for the time being. Of course, Taiwan is still very interested in getting a free trade agreement, and I suppose those negotiations will continue, and we may see something later down the line in the Biden administration.
All right, it's been good talking to you. Thanks so much, Ian.
Thank you.
It all began with students protesting about a hike in metro fares, but it's mushroomed into something much bigger. Long before Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, Chile was a testbed for unfettered free market economics, or neoliberalism, under the right-wing dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. That experiment in the 1970s was continued by democratic governments from 1990 to the present day. Pinochet's rule was an economic failure. Post-dictatorship, the economy has performed better than its neighbours, but it has failed to address inequality. Access to pensions, healthcare and education were left to the free market. The people finally got to vote on the constitution. The outcome? A landslide to scrap the charter in favour of more government intervention in the state. So what now? Well, there's a long way to go before the people of Chile see any change. Well, joining me now via Skype from London is Nikhil Sangani, Latin America economist at Capital Economics. Good to have you with us. So Chile has been this success story for developing countries for so long. What's gone wrong?
Well, I think if you look at Chile over the last few decades, it's been a regional outperformer in Latin America in aggregate terms. But I think one of the issues is that not all of the citizens have enjoyed those gains in the economy. I think there was a sense that among many of the citizens that the benefits only went to those at the top. And that's why we saw those mass protests last year calling to reduce inequality and provide better public welfare provisions for things like education and healthcare. So I think even though on aggregate the economy has done well, possibly those towards the bottom end of the distribution haven't been able to enjoy it as much.
So when you look at those people on the streets, as you said, basically does that vindicate what economists like Joseph Stiglitz have been saying, that neoliberalism has undermined democracy for the last 40 years, that trickle-down economics hasn't worked?
I think it depends in whether we look at it in an absolute or relative sense. I mean, a lot of Chileans have moved out of poverty over the last 40 years with these neoliberal free market principles because the economy was growing fairly well. And so most people are in a better position than they were, say, 40 years ago. But if we look in a relative sense, then income inequality has widened. And there's a feeling amongst those at the bottom that they've seen others and their wealth and income massively escalate, whereas in a relative sense, those for the everyday person, it's maybe not increased as much. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that neoliberalism has totally failed. It's probably just been more of a case that it hasn't done enough in Chileans' view to benefit everyone.
Right. Now, it is a long process of changing the constitution, right?
Yeah, so there's still a long way to go. So we had the referendum last month, where Chileans voted to have a new constitution. As part of that vote, they also elected to have the new constitution drafted by a constituent assembly filled with normal citizens, rather than a mix of citizens and current politicians. And that constituent assembly will be elected in April. And that assembly will then have to draft the new constitution, and there'll have to be a 2/3 majority for any clause that goes in to the new constitution. That process will take about a year, and then the new charter will be put to another referendum in 2022 for the people to vote. And it's only at that stage where there may be a new political system in Chile.
So we're looking at years before we know exactly what the people want. But is there anything on the horizon that we can say that's probably one of the changes that's going to be introduced?
I think the main thing we could see is a shift towards greater state intervention in the economy.
Okay, what sectors are we talking? Pensions, education, healthcare?
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the protests that we saw last year were calling for things like a better public welfare provision for healthcare, education and pensions. And it looks like the state will play a greater role in all three parts in all of those sectors anyway.
And that could be a positive for the economy?
I think for education and healthcare in particular, if it means that there's more good quality and widespread provision of healthcare and education, that could boost the potential of the economy if it means that there's a more knowledgeable, more educated and healthier workforce. But there is, of course, a risk that the state sector goes too far, and if they venture into other areas of the economy where there's perhaps a better left to the private sector, there's a risk they could crowd out the more productive private sector. So at this stage, it's probably too early to say whether that will be a good or a bad thing for the economy.
So it's about finding the balance, isn't it? Well, there will be a need for spending to increase, right? But the government does have some room to maneuver, right, with debt at 30% of GDP.
One thing that Chile has in its favor is that its debt position is very low, especially compared to others in Latin America. And so we've already seen them enact quite substantial stimulus during the coronavirus pandemic, worth about 12% of GDP on things like wage subsidy schemes, for example. And it looks like in their latest budget, they've said that they're going to continue keeping spending fairly high over the next few years to try and stimulate the economy, because their public finances came into the crisis in pretty good shape.
All right, thanks so much for your thoughts and analysis on that, Nikhil there.
Thank you.
Argentina's Congress is debating a bill seeking to raise billions of dollars from the super rich. The one-off tax is meant to support families who've been hit hard by the pandemic. Teresa Bo reports from Buenos Aires.
Argentina's tax pie and how it should be sliced amid an economic crisis has become food for lively discussion in Buenos Aires. And now, for the first time, deputies are set to debate imposing a wealth tax on Argentines who have over $2 million in assets. Thousands took to the streets outside Congress to show support for the new tax and the government of Alberto Fernández.
We are seeing a very delicate situation in Argentina, with people struggling to find food, people who have lost their jobs. So imposing a tax on wealth is necessary.
The tax under discussion would amount to 2% for individuals with assets worth more than $2.5 million and scale up to as much as 5.25 for ultra-wealthy citizens holding their fortunes outside the country.
Argentina is desperate for funds as the coronavirus pandemic has had a devastating impact in the economy. Poverty rates are close to 50%. But commercial chambers in the country warn that a wealth tax in this context could have an impact on potential investors who already see the country as negative for business.
Several multinationals are fleeing this South American nation, claiming that doing business in Argentina is complicated and unprofitable. Volatile politics, price and currency controls, and state interventionism are part of doing business here. The law is being debated as Argentina begins discussing with the IMF how to pay over $40 billion in debt. Facundo Suárez Lastra says the opposition will vote against the law.
This kind of tax is pro-recession. It's not a tax that will promote investment. On the contrary, the problem is how this tax is being discussed and the public protest by the government that generates a climate against business. There was no discussion. The only intention is to show that they are champions of the poor when they are giving in to the austerity measures demanded by the IMF.
But President Alberto Fernández said the new tax is meant to aid public coffers to cope with the pandemic.
We are living in times where solidarity has to be the role. In Congress, we see the debate on wealth tax. What is being debated is whether those who have more can express in terms of emergency in solidarity with the rest of the country.
These are difficult times for Argentina. Years of recession and inflation and the impact of the pandemic have left millions in need. Finding balance between providing aid and stabilizing the economy is seen as crucial to help the country leave its economic troubles behind.
As the promise of vaccines sends stocks to record highs, some governments are already thinking about how they're going to pay for the cost of the pandemic. But is it premature when the recovery isn't expected to kick in until late 2021 at best? Well, let's get some analysis from Jamil Ahmed, Director of Investment Strategy at German fintech company Naga. Good to have you with us. So governments are looking at a range of things from like tax increases to austerity measures. Is this the right thing to do you think?
Absolutely not. Look, too many livelihoods have been impacted by this, whether that's due to jobs, loved ones, other unfortunate circumstances from this pandemic, and even by lots of governments' accounts and their narratives. We are still at the early stages of this pandemic in terms of the economic rescue plan. So it would be very premature to be moving ahead on any kind of how to pay this money back.
But Jamil, let me jump in and be the devil's advocate for these governments. If they've got bills to pay, they've got bills to pay. What are they supposed to do?
So the government's essentially, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if they kick the can down the road, it could be impacting future generations. For example, there's millions and millions of people, young school kids who have not been at school for many months, and they do not want them to be impacted potentially 10 years from now. But at the same time, when there's hundreds of millions of people who are still going through forms of hardships, whether there's economic or personal hardships, it's insensitive to be doing this now. And the vaccine has not been approved yet, nor has it been rolled out, distributed, and proved that it's going to work for a mass amount of people globally. So what the governments essentially have to do, and what's happening right now, is that hands are tied around throats, because world debt to GDP has increased to 362% this year. Just to give some figures behind that number, it started this year at around 320%. So over the past 9 to 10 months, it's grown insurmountably. And other governments, such as the United Kingdom, have not spent this much money in the governments since wartime. So we're talking about the early and mid 1940s. And yet this economy, specifically the UK, it's still the worst impacted by this pandemic across all industrial and G7 nations. That gives some kind of appetite towards what this dilemma has been, the big problem. But essentially, until we get back to a recovery that has a flat road, we know the vaccine works, we know that things can slowly and gradually get back to normal, because at the moment we've had a bump, then we've gone back, we've had a traffic light situation, essentially. Until we get on a straight road, we don't know how successful this is going to be. And that's why we have to get back onto that path before we can decide to say how we're going to begin to pay that money back. Of course, it has to be paid back. It's correct conversation, but it's not a solution that has to be solved today.
So I take it you agree with what the IMF is saying. They're saying wait until the recovery becomes really well established.
I definitely do. Not only with the IMF, but all of the world central banks too. What the IMF has said is that this pace of recovery is going to be uneven, it's going to be bumpy. They've used that kind of narrative to say that every economy is going to go through different situations, such as they have already in the pandemic. But the Federal Reserve Chair, which is the US Central Bank, Jerome Powell, has gone to say that when this economy does get back onto an even footing, the normal will be different to what it was before. And there's going to be a huge group of people, which is going to include employees, it's going to, of course, include businesses, it's also going to include many sectors that are going to continue to need support. And that means by support, they need to have more government aid, they need to have more stimulus, they need to have more central bank measures. And actually the nudge in the direction right now is that governments still have an influential role to play to do more in order for the economies to get back. Because one of the lessons from the global financial crisis, I know we don't want to talk about something that was 13 years ago, but one of the lessons was that actually the governments did not move fast enough. That's why the recovery took as long as 10 years or so. We were still talking about it even before this pandemic. Now, this pandemic, we might get it over with by 2021 in terms of a vaccine, but we certainly do not want to be talking about it 5 years or so from now, which is why for the next 1 year, the support has to remain in place. Hopefully by 2022, 2023, an action plan can then be put into place as well to how to get this debt issue back under some sort of sustainable control.
Well, you're talking about 2022, 2023. The road is bumpy. Vaccines haven't been approved yet. Are the markets getting ahead of themselves with all this optimism?
Asset prices are always the first things to price something in very early. And again, to use that comment that the IMF have made just recently, the disconnect between asset prices, which basically means global markets, and the real economy is tremendous. It's even larger now than it already was at the beginning of this year. And that's where we already thought there was a big discrepancy in place. essentially markets believe that this vaccine is going to be approved within days and weeks, and everybody has their fingers crossed that that's going to be the case. But they also believe that things are going to be very, very quick and there's going to be a sudden recovery. They also thought the same thing at the beginning of the first wave when we were in that interim period where things were starting to be reopened up. But then they did not take into account that we'd have the setback and that worldwide restrictions would come into place once again. So asset prices will always do this, but it does not mean that the economy is justified and in the right place. The disconnect is tremendous here.
All right, always good talking to you. Thanks so much, Jamil.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye. The news on Al Jazeera is next.